Thanks for coming out. So my name is Grandja and this is Winch, and we're going to be talking about the new features of Spring Security 4.1. So before we start, I just want to gauge the audience and understand who is currently using Spring Security. If you could raise your hand. That's awesome, great. How about Spring Boot? Perfect, okay. So we're actually this is gonna be a hands-on session. We put together a demo application. It's built on Spring Boot, and obviously, and it's an Angular application, single page application. And what we're gonna do, basically, I'm gonna start off demoing this app with no security, and we're gonna progress through this app by adding security and demonstrating the new features. Okay, so that's basically how we're gonna go about it. So I'm gonna start off by just showing you an app. It's a really basic messaging app, and this is it right over here. So as you can see, we got an inbox, right? Sent. We could send the message. You guys having fun? You guys enjoying the conference? I'm definitely having a great time. So that's pretty much it there. So we're gonna just jump into it and we're gonna add security right away. So as most of you know, with Spring Boot, Spring Boot checks the class path and auto configures things. So right now, this is a Gradle project, and we do have Spring Security in the class path, but to disable it, we basically just had this exclude here, right? It's the security auto configuration. This actually auto configures HTTP basic, and by default protects all the endpoints. So we're going to disable that. And right now, technically, Spring Boot auto configuration would take effect, but we're gonna provide our own. We'll call it security config. Excuse my typos. So this is pretty much our configuration. So basically we're going to start off with HTTP basic, and we are going to allow full access to assets and WebJars, because that's where our Angular app resides. And all other endpoints, you need to be authenticated. So the thing to note here, in case you didn't know, is this web security annotation imports this web security configuration. So this is where it all happens. This is where the Spring Security filter chain or the delegating or the filter chain proxy gets built. And it actually looks for web security configure adapter implementations in the application context, and ultimately calls this configure method, passing the HTTP security so you could ultimately configure it. So that's kind of how it works behind the scenes in a nutshell. So now that we've added security, let's check it out. Let's go to the app and see what happens. So there we go. HTTP basic auth prompt pops up, and we're going to log in right now. And there we go, we got security happening, right? So that was pretty quick, right? That was pretty easy. The beauty of the Spring framework is minimal code, right? It just makes your life easier, right? Cross-site request forgery. So one of the features that we added, so Angular, the way Angular works, right, is it expects a cross-site request forgery token as a cookie, reads the cookie, then passes it into the header, right? That's by default how Angular operates. So we want to play nice with Angular, right? Because by default, the cross-site request forgery tokens are stored in an HTTP session, and cookies written back, the session cookie, and that's how it's linked, right? So Angular can't get the token, can't set the header, and therefore this will happen, right? We'll try to add a message here. All right, so we get this error. Let's take a look at this error here. And as we can see, forbidden, could not verify cross-site request forgery token, all right? So how can we fix that? So that's part of this new feature. So let's go back into our configuration here and add that. So the important setting here is with HTTP only false. We need to ensure that the HTTP flag on the cookie is false, or else obviously Angular won't be able to read that cookie if it's secure, as scripts are prohibited from reading cookies if it's set to true, or set to true. So we're setting it to false here, and we're going to go back to the demo and try to add a message. There we go. So we're good, right? Let's actually look at that request in detail just to see what's happening here. I should have left my developer tools open. We'll just do that one more time so we could see. Okay, so let's inspect that request here. So here's the post. I'm going to expand that a bit so you guys could see that. As you can see the request headers here, we see the token, right? CRSFR token in the request and the cookie. So that was pretty easy, right? That was pretty easy, you know, simple configuration here. We're playing nice with Angular, right? So that's does somebody have a question over there? Or? Sorry?
The question is, in Chrome, can you show the cookies? Yeah, he could. It's the same cookie that was in the request, in the... So he wants to see the HTTP only flag, he said.
Oh, okay. Let's...
Yeah, it's in the resources.
Yeah, we should go over here. There we go, right? So as you can see, it's false.
Yeah, and you know it's false because otherwise Angular wouldn't have sent it because they can't read it then.
Exactly. All right, so that's one of the features we added. So we're playing nice with Angular there. So the next thing I want to talk about is login. I mean, right now we have this. I'm going to close this session. I'm going to start a new one here. I keep pressing the cap locks here. Let's go here. Okay, I mean, this is not pretty, right? We want a custom login page. So one of the features that we added as well for login, by default, the login endpoint will, if you're not authenticated, it will send back a redirect to the login endpoint. So it'll be a 302 redirect. For a single page application, you know, we don't want that to happen, right? We ultimately want a 401, right? And that way the Angular app could handle popping up the login, right? So what we added was, we added a new request matcher that checks for a specific HTTP header, X requested with, right? If that's coming in on the header, then it will set the status code to 401 instead of a 302 redirect. So I'm gonna demonstrate that right now too.
And while he's doing that, just to elaborate a little bit, what he means is if you have HTTP basic and form login at the same time, what Spring Security is going to do is it's going to do some sort of content negotiation based upon headers. It looks at the accept headers. It'll also look at the X requested with header, as he mentioned, and it'll decide what is the appropriate response. And in a browser, it'll also remove the www authenticate because JavaScript can't handle a www authenticate. So if it looks like it's in a browser, it won't do the www authenticate.
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, I just added the minimal configuration for form login. This is a default behavior, right? You hit a protected endpoint, which we did. We tried to access the inbox. 302 comes back and it tries to it redirects it back to the login page, right? So that's not playing nice with Angular. We just want a 401 to pop back, and then I got it all set up on the client side to pop up the login box. So let's do that as the next step here. By the way, this is my first time live coding. Can you guys tell? I know you can, but that's all good. All right, so let's, all right, there we go, all right? Like that's a lot more prettier, right? So we have this, and let's look at that, the X requested with. Like I was saying here, we go to the local host, go to this request here, and in the request headers here, where is it here? Huh. Oh, you know what? Sorry. Yeah, that was the initial one. Yeah. So we're good now. So we have a custom form login, and we're back in, right? So that's the feature we added for login. I want to get into. I'm just going to do a time check here because we definitely killed a lot of time with the technical difficulties. Let's jump into because I definitely. Okay. Yeah. There's definitely one topic that I really want to talk about is content security policy. But before we get into that, I want to demonstrate. There's actually this really good blog here. It's a pretty detailed blog if you guys are interested in checking it out yourself. But basically, it talks about a cross-site scripting exploit within Angular 1.4. It's been corrected in 1.5. We're actually using 1.4 here. I'm going to demonstrate that. But in a nutshell, you're able to inject script content to run arbitrary JavaScript. And the way it works, this exploit is overriding the char@, function of the string object with the array.join and then adding arbitrary script. So I'm going to demonstrate that. And the arbitrary script is just going to be an alert, right? But it could be anything, right? So let's demonstrate that. I'm going to get this. So this is it here. So I'm going to add this message. So as you can see here, I'm definitely not a JavaScript expert, but I could definitely explain this. So as you can see here, we're assigning the array.join function to the car@, so ultimately overriding that, and then we have this eval, right? And this eval, this could be anything, right? I just got alert box here, but this could literally be anything, right? So I'm going to add this. And then I'm going to go back to this other page, and I'm going to explain why I'm going back here and what the difference is with this one. And I just happen to know it's 1, 2, 3. There you go, right? So this alert comes up, right? So this is the exploit. And the reason, the main issue behind this is in Angular doesn't recommend mixing client-side and server-side templates, and that's what this demonstrates. I have a thime leaf template on the server, and instead of like Angular just pure client template, it actually renders some of that user input on the thime leaf template, and then it comes back to the client, and that's what's happening here. So it's not recommended that you mix that, and that's the root issue. But you can't prevent that. Errors happen, right? Errors happen. So what can you do to prevent that happening? Because if you're not aware of this issue, because it is a fairly new issue. I think it was reported last January, and it's not too many people know of it. So it's definitely an easy error to happen. So how can we solve this? How can we stop this from happening? So content security policy, right? It's a W3C recommendation and still in draft form, but they've done a lot of work and it's quite promising. In a nutshell, it allows you to whitelist origins of trusted sources. That's the easiest explanation I could put out there. So for example, if I want to trust domain, obviously I trust same origin, but if I want to trust domain A and domain B to load scripts, I can do that with this, right? Because there's quite a few different directives. There's like a script source directive, object source directive, style source directive, and ultimately you could set, what scripts can load for this page, what styles can load, what plugins can load, and so forth, right? So it's a pretty powerful, powerful spec in my opinion, and it could solve this, and we're going to do that right now. We're gonna solve that issue, and I'm going to demonstrate that. So yeah, I have an in-memory database here, and because I'm starting over again, it's going to erase that record. So I'm just going to put it in here so it reloads. I don't want to add it again, but we'll take a look at it, validate that it's still there. And there it is, right? This is the one I just put in there, right? So let's go back to that page now that mixes server-side templates and client-side templates and ultimately injects that content that comes back. We'll go back there. I'm going to go to 1, 2, 3. There you go. Doesn't pop up, right? But how does this work? Let's see. So as you can see here, there's an error, right, within Angular, because ultimately it's calling that car@ function internally, and it's just spitting out this error, right? So that solves that. But let's look at this. Let's look at this configuration. So what does this say? So default source self, and then these two different domains because we're accessing the Angular dependencies from these two domains. So for the main application, so I specified that there, and obviously self, same origin, and style source. So for styles, I want to be able to load, styles from same origin, and then we have this unsafe inline. I'm going to talk about that in a bit, but before we get to that, I'm going to take out all of this configuration just to demonstrate what the browser actually does when a violation happens. Because I'm loading scripts. So right now I'm basically saying you could load scripts, styles, and connect source, and get into that all same origin only, right? So let's see what happens here when I try to access my Angular app right now. So there you go. Like we have quite a few errors here, right? What is this saying here? So this is saying, Angular, the Angular source is not going to be loaded because it violates, right? So as you can see, it's just not loading at all. So let's bring that configuration back, and I'm going to get into this style source right now, and especially this unsafe inline. Okay, so I'm allowing Google APIs and Cloudflare to be loaded right now. Let's see what happens right now. Looks like my computer is freezing again. While this is starting up, content security policy 2, the recommended, so content security policy, I mean, there's websites out there, right, that have inline script, inline styles. How can you leverage the full power of content security policy? So there's this, you could exercise the report only header. So what happens here is, if you want to start, leveraging content security policy and see exactly what vulnerabilities are exposed in your websites, you could set up this same policy here, but report only, right? The report only flag. So what this does is, it sets a different header. Instead of content security policy, it's content security policy report only. And there's another directive, report URI. So we would specify an endpoint that would accept these JSON report violations. And the beautiful thing about this is if you got a bank website, right, and it's a big site, you cannot, you have all these potential vulnerabilities and there's scripts everywhere, inline scripts and inline styles. You can't just go and refactor that, right? But you want to understand what violations are happening, right? So what you can do is you could set a report only flag. So the browser doesn't actually enforce these violations. It reports on them, right? And it sends it to those endpoints, and then ultimately, an administrator or DevOps could take a look and see what violations are happening and start refactoring slowly, tightening up security, right? So it's quite powerful, right? And it's definitely the recommended practice or the recommendation if you want to start leveraging content security policies, using that strategy, understanding where are the holes, right? And start refactoring and fixing it up. And as the violations are pretty much eliminated, then you could turn that flag off, right? And then everything's in effect, right? So it's quite powerful. So content security policy, obviously, it bans inline scripts, right? And inline styles. And yeah, definitely got some issues still happening here, but I'm gonna like wrap it up, but I want to talk about this unsafe inline here. So yeah, content security policy bans, you know, inline scripts and inline styles. So, but you know, a lot of websites have that. You can't just go refactor, right? So you might need to allow that, right? And that's what's happening here with style source, because Angular in this case actually has inline styles. So that's kind of why I have that directive value there, just to allow that. Although it's obviously, you know, you're opening up a hole there, right? But it's somewhere to start. But eventually, the goal is to refactor so you don't have inline scripts and inline styles, and you could tighten it up. So that's pretty much it for the, yeah, this is definitely still not working, but is there any questions before I hand this over to Rob?
Yeah. So repeat the question.
I didn't quite, yeah.
So the question was, what he's asking if there's an easy way to do just RESTful APIs with Spring Security using the DSL. And the answer is no, because there's no exact answer for RESTful APIs, right? I mean, there's tons of ways of doing RESTful API security. So you can easily do what he was doing with the HTTP basic. And if you don't do the form login, then it's only going to be HTTP responses. But we'll talk about why you don't want to do HTTP basic throughout your entire application later on in the presentation for a RESTful API. But you know, you might be using OAuth. You might I mean, the possibilities are endless. REST doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, as you might have experienced in work. It's nice because it simplifies things and defines everything up front, so everything's really easy, and then you debate about what method you should be calling and what URI it should be and what security mechanism you should be. So it's, yeah. Why even do form? Oh, why did he do form login? Oh, yeah, so that was something that he kind of glossed over a little bit, probably due to the technical difficulties. But if someone types a direct URL in your browser, the browser will still do the redirect, right? Because the user is still interacting through the browser. You don't want HTTP basic then, because the user doesn't know how to respond to a 401. So if they type in a URL directly, it'll send them a redirect to the login page, which is just / in this case. And at that point, whenever the home page comes up, it makes a RESTful API call using the JavaScript, and that fails. And that sends back a 401, in this case without the www authenticate, because it knows it's a browser and JavaScript can't process it if it has www authenticate. And then the JavaScript handles that 401, sending you to the Angular login page. Does that make sense? Yes? Any other questions? We got something going?
All right. I just wanted to get it all ready for you. I apologize for the technical difficulties there. But yeah.
All right, let's see here. 20 minutes. All right, so one of the things that we also kind of jumped around on was the authentication mechanism. Joe briefly mentioned that looks like I'm going to be. My fingers aren't very good with the key bindings here. Let's see. We'll just manually navigate here. Okay, so where is that username password coming from? Right now it's coming from this application YAML file, and you can You can possibly see, it might be a little too small, but if you can't see, I guess Command plus doesn't work. If you can't see, it's basically joe@example.com and password. And so why did we put that in there? Well, the default for Spring Security and boot is going to be using user as a username and a secure random generated password every time you start up. And it's a UID. So we didn't want to have to copy paste it. So we put it in there ahead of the presentation to save a little bit of typing and preventing some people from sleeping. So we have that now, but the problem is this doesn't work because we already have our own user system. So for example, I think these key bindings are different than mine. I have lots of custom key bindings and I don't use IntelliJ too much. So apologize my mouse clicking. But you can see we have users added to our database already. So you might say, okay, well, we already have these users. We don't want to use the YAML file. What can we do? Well, one thing you could do is you could use Spring's JDBC support. And the JDBC support would allow you to translate some result of a SQL query into a user object. And that's nice because you don't have to write any code. Who here likes to write code? Hope everyone writes their hand. Yeah. Who here likes to use other code and make things work fast? Hopefully everyone raises their hand there too. But you got to focus on the business line. But so the business value. But the thing is here, you might say, well, I don't like writing any code. I don't want to do it. I want to use this built-in support. But the problem is Spring Security has its own representation of a user, and it doesn't have all of your domain values on it. If I added first and last name to Spring Security, or anyone added it to Spring Security's user object, who would be happy? Maybe 5 people. If I added an address to it, maybe another 5 people. All of a sudden, you have this giant object, and everyone is angry because there's way too many attributes on there, and it's probably still missing some. So what can you do to make it so that it represents your user and the user that Spring Security wants to have? So the easiest way to do that is going to be, all right, this is going to drive me nuts. What's your key binding for open type?
Commando.
Commando?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Okay. So here you can see I have a user detail service. And the user detail service is is basically a way of hooking into that mechanism of defining what the user is. And it's very simple. It says, given a username, I'm going to load this user by username. And the contract you can see is going to be user details. So it needs to return a user details. But we just said that we don't want it to be just Spring Security's definition of a user, right? Because we want to represent our additional attributes. So how can we do that? Well, in Java, you can extend a class once, but you can implement in as many interfaces as you want. So fortunately, user details is an interface, and we have our own user representation that we're extending. So custom user details is a user, and it is a user details. So it's both. Spring Security refers to it as a user details to make authorization decisions on our behalf and to authenticate the user. And we can refer to it as a user object. Pretty simple, right? And you might say, well, how do I configure this? Well, in Spring Security 4.1, all you have to do is define the user details service as a bean, and you're configured. This isn't a Spring Boot specific feature. This is Spring Security in general. So all you got to do is define the user details service as a bean, and you are ready to go. Now, let's see if I know. What's your restart the app? I'll just do this.
So Command F9.
Command F9. Okay.
Yeah, it'll get DevTools going.
Thanks. All right, so now I'm getting that response. And you can see down here at the bottom, that's that 401 that I was saying is caused by that JSON request, whereas the initial request, basically the redirect is just having the JSON perform that request. So rob@example.com. And now I'm authenticated. So now I'm authenticating with a custom user, but you might notice that it still says Joe is logged in. That seems a little broken. Well, part of the reason for that, or I guess the entire reason for that, is when we first started this application out, there was no concept of of a user. We didn't have security added yet. So we created this mock current user, and that's how we're referring to the current user. Obviously, it's not Joe at this time, so we're going to go ahead and delete it. And we're going to fix this in our controllers. So this is going to be handled in our security controller. And how do we get our current user? Well, there's a number of options. We'll go over a few of them here. So earlier I said whatever is returned by that user detail service is going to be populated on our security context holders authentication principal. Hard to understand, but a little easier to visualize. But there's problems with this code, right? There's a cast in here. There's security context holder dot with a static method right there. And then I'm referring to Spring Security specific code. So all of these things are not ideal. So let's see how we can improve on this a little bit. So one thing we can do, and we're not actually going to run this code because it's not our end goal, but one thing I could do is something like this. And you'll see there's some errors because I'm not doing the imports because we're just going to move along. But the thing is authentication implements principal. And Spring MVC, if it sees something that implements principal, it's going to resolve that from the HTTP servlet request. And Spring Security will automatically populate that authentication on the HTTP servlet request, and so it'll get resolved. So what does this solve? It solves the static method call, but it doesn't solve anything else. We're still referring to Spring Security specific APIs, and we're still performing the cast. So how can we fix these things? Another option we can do is okay. Key bindings are not my friend on this computer, but that's all right. That's all right. We're all right. So authentication principal. What is the authentication principal doing? It's an annotation provided by Spring Security, and it has a runtime retention, so there's no compile time dependency here. But the problem is that we still have a dependency on Spring Security. What does it do? Well, it allows you to resolve the exact same thing that we saw earlier, but without any casting. But we still have this dependency on authentication principal. So if your application depends on Spring Security everywhere because you have to refer to your current user everywhere, which is pretty common because you're probably getting data based upon the current user, then you're going to have this annotation scattered throughout your code. And this isn't ideal. As much as I want you to stick with Spring Security, I don't want you to have the code spread everywhere. If you need to leave, it should be very easy to leave Spring Security. So you could do something a little better with, so here's a meta annotation. Who here has heard about the Spring meta annotations? Lots of hands, great. Who here knows about the Spring Security meta annotations? A couple of hands, cool. So right here you can see I have an annotation, and all it is an annotation annotated with one or more annotations, a meta annotation, right? And now this annotation is my annotation that I own in my application. And the authentication principal is Spring Security. So now what happens if I have to remove Spring Security? Well, I have current users spread throughout my code base. So the only thing I have to do is remove authentication principal from here and then provide something to process that annotation. Since I'm using Spring Security and the authentication principal annotation, I don't need anything to process it. Spring Security provides something to process that annotation, right? So you don't have to do anything extra there. So now what I can do is all right, so what I can do is I can replace that in all the other places. So we have another location. So this is whenever you create a new message, it says who the message is from. So now that will automatically have the correct user as well. And I think there's an import here. All right, so now at this point, is it Command F9 you said?
Command F9, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Command F9, yeah.
I guess it just doesn't pop up.
Just make sure the hot swap is, yeah, it's
Let's
gone.
just do this. All right, so now I'm able to resolve that user very easily using current user, and now I should be able to see that it's Rob Winch, right? And it's a lot nicer because I have all my Spring Security dependency isolated to that one meta annotation, and I can refer to it everywhere else. Now, another thing you'll notice is that I still have this inbox, and this inbox actually is populated with the wrong information. It's all to Joe. It should be to me. So how can I do that? Well, we could use the current user and pass it into the controller, and then the controller could pass it on to my data layer if I wanted, right? That could be one way of doing it. But another way is you can use Spring Security's Spring Data Support. So I can go to the message repository. And that message repository has an inbox method and a sent message method. And those methods are what define how to query for Spring Security. Now, where is the principal coming from? Remember, we said earlier, whatever we return in our user detail service is what the principal is, right? So if that is our user object and it has an ID, I can refer to it using this spell expression. So this is spell extensions with Spring data. And the way that that's done is there's a security data configuration. So this is Spring Boot specific in terms of automatic configuration. Basically, if it sees Spring Security data on the class path, then it's going to automatically add this bean. If you're not using Spring Boot, you have to manually provide that bean. So once again, Spring Boot saves the day. And now if I refresh, now it's displaying Rob's messages. So the query is updated. And the thing that's nice about this integration is you could do the check afterwards, but think about paging logic, right? If you don't do it in the query, you're basically going to be hosed if you have a million records and you don't know which ones you have access to. So you really need to update your queries in order to do proper authorization. And you can do double checking or checks on things that are not collections using, after the results have come back. But if there's a lot of results, you have to update the query in order to keep your application scaling. Let's see. So we've covered quite a few things. Let's cover something else that's new in Spring Security 4.1. So right now I can see Rob Winch by accessing this URL. And it's a REST URL, but if I'm a hacker, I can access whatever I want. And I can also access Joe's information and any other user's information in this application. And it'd be ideal if I was limited to accessing only my user's information. So what's one way we could do that? Well, we could do that with method security, or if we want, we could do Spring Security's new path variables. So we have ant matchers, users, and user ID. So that's a path variable. You've probably seen those in Spring MVC. And then I will say access and the user ID equals. So remember, if we need to refer to the current user, we can do principal, and then the identifier of that, and then there's a little gotcha here. ToString. You might say, well, why is there a ToString there? That's kind of annoying, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But the reason for that is because whenever we parse the user's URL with that user ID in there, that's going to be a string. And the principal ID is a long. So if we try to compare those two, it's obviously not going to be equal, and it would fail. It would always fail. So now if I do a refresh here, I get a forbidden. And if I access Rob, I have access. So that's kind of nice. You might say, well, that was kind of cool, but I don't like that ToString, and it's kind of hard to debug and deal with those expressions. And with that, we agree. So now what I'm going to do is I'm using a bean. So who here knew that in Spring spell, basically, you can refer to any bean using an @ symbol? A decent show of hands. Awesome. Go everyone. So how's that working? Well, I have a bean called auth, and there's a method called check. And that method has a parameter of user ID, which is a long, and a user object. And going back to our security configuration here, the user ID, earlier I said it was a type string. But now we have a method signature, so Spring knows how to convert a string into a long. So I don't have to do anything fancy there. It does it for me, right? So we don't have to do that .toString that we did earlier. And what's more is it knows that principal is our user object. Again, user detail service, whatever it returns, is going to be exactly what we are referring to, and it's a user and it's a user details. So we just refer to it as a user, and we can easily test this class using a simple unit test. So all our logic is constrained within here. We won't go through the demonstrating that works. You can take my word for it or call BS and try it later. Let's see. Another thing that I really want to show you is my cool admin URL. So this URL is only for admins. And I didn't go over this, but right now we have it hard-coded for the users. Every user is going to be a role user. So I could just simplify this and say no users are allowed to access URL. And it makes it a lot more firm, so no one can access this URL. So how would I do that? Well, I could say something like ant matchers. And if I could hit that S, it would go a lot better. Deny all. And so what is this going to do? Well, if you look at my admin controller, my admin controller is /admin. So the two match, and things are going to get denied. It's awesome, right? Everything's perfect. No, it's not, because otherwise this wouldn't be a demo. All right, so we have a forbidden, but what is wrong? Anyone? Anyone know what's wrong? Other than Joe? Joe's. Anyone know how to bypass this? Okay, so the problem is Spring MVC has a hidden feature. If I do / after it, it still maps to that same controller. Uh-oh, things are broke. See a lot of nodding heads. Anyone know another one? .json. It removes file extensions. So there's ways around it, right? Joe was talking earlier about content security policy, right? Content security policy is known as defense in depth. You don't want to have cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in the first place, right? But just in case, you want to have another layer of protection, content security policy. What can we do here to prevent this from being exploited? Well, we can go into here and we can change this to be MVC matchers. And now what's going to happen is if I request any of those URLs that map to that controller, it's still going to get it denied. And how's that working? Well, we have Spring MVC recently provided an API that allows us to integrate with the path matching logic, so it knows what paths would match a particular request mapping. So hopefully, I'm only doing MVC matchers for that one URL because it's a demo and you don't want to watch me type the same thing over and over, but hopefully you guys will switch all of yours over to MVC matchers for that reason. And so that kind of demonstrates the MVC matchers, but what it also demonstrates, along with the content security policy demo, there needs to be defense in depth, right? We can't just have a single layer of protection. So how can we provide authorization at another level? And we can do that using method security. So to enable it, we need enable global method security. And then we need to enable what type of method security. So there's a lot of different annotations that Spring Security supports. I prefer the pre and post annotations, but you might be, like a JSR, and there's a JSR specific one. It's not as powerful, but if you want to stick to the JSRs, you can do that. And there's a couple options there, but basically you'll pick the one that you want to use. And then after that, you need to go to your method that you want to secure. And here I have a annotation that says post authorize. So what does that mean? It means after this method is invoked, I'm going to perform some sort of authorization. And this is handy because it's a read-only operation, and I don't know my decision until afterwards. So what do I want to do? If the message that's returned is to or from the current user, again, remember, the principal is whatever we returned, which is a user object, .id. So basically, if it's to or from that user, then I'm going to grant access. So that expression needs to evaluate to a Boolean. And that return object is a special reserved word for the object that's being returned. So that's what it's referring to. And for anyone not familiar with spell, the question mark is basically return null. Don't give me a null pointer exception. If the return object is null and I have question mark dot, then it'll basically evaluate to null without getting a null pointer. So that's all that's doing. And you might say, cool, but that's a really gnarly expression. And I don't want to repeat that for find by summary. And for that, we also agree. So how can we fix this? Well, we have a number of options. I'm going to go ahead and do the easiest one. Let's see here. Readable message. So what is this? Well, it's a meta annotation annotated with post-authorize, and on that, it has the auth check. So going back to our bean reference, now we're using the second method where the first parameter is a message and the second parameter is a user. So now I'm checking to see if that user has access. And there's nothing special about using auths. I just chose that. It's whatever the bean name is. So you can pass it into any bean name, and you get the full power of spell. And you could do that post-authorize directly on that method if you wanted to. But again, do you want to repeat that everywhere you're doing that check? Or do you want to have your own annotations and be able to replace it once if you drop Spring Security, right? And what's more is you don't get typo, once you get it typed once, you don't have any typos if you're changing, adding it other places, or if you refactor it, it's only one place. So it provides a lot of values. So now, if I say messages 200, I get a internal server error, which is totally expected. Not really. The demo gods are not with me, so we gotta, oh, I know what's happening. But I don't know what's happening. There's a JavaScript. Super JavaScript. So basically what's going to happen is I don't have null checks in that auth, so good job writing unit tests, right? Go me. So right now, if the message is to or from me, it comes up. And if it's, I think this one is also allowed, so then it's 122. There we go. So now we get our forbidden. So that one's not to or from me. And it looks like we're starting to run low on time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I hope you guys have enjoyed the presentation, but I'd like to open it up for a few questions. Anyone have any questions? Yes, please. So the question is when it's giving these error messages, where is that configured in the Spring? Specifically the 401 and 403. So are you wondering where the 401, the fact that it's returning a 401, or how it's displaying the 401? Where the 401 is coming from, not where the view that is handling that. Is that right? So there's two things. So to be clear, there's two things that happen. Spring Security basically provides a access denied exception, and it throws that in its access decision manager, right? And so that, well, I guess there's probably three things happening. And then there's a filter that basically catches that called the exception handling filter, and that filter is using a access denied handler to set the status. And then Spring Boot has something in it that basically says, given this status, I'm going to process it this way, and that's what's rendering this UI for you. Does that make sense? And in Spring Boot 1.4, there's an easy way to, there's a conventions of if you have a URL that has, I can't remember the exact convention, but it might be like error 401 or error 404. It's some convention based upon the HTTP status code. If you provide a view for that, it'll allow you to customize that view. Refer to the doc for the exact pattern. I don't remember that, but it does have the HTTP status code in there. Any other questions? Yes, please. Who earlier was asking the REST security question? I think it was this gentleman over there. Can you see his hand raised? She's asking right here. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, so the question is it better to define the security policies in the code versus the XML file? And I'm assuming you mean in terms of just configuration. Is it better? I'm sorry? Oh, so basically the URL mappings permissions? Yeah, so that's basically the Spring Bean definitions. And so the question is it better to define those that Spring security configuration for authorization on those URLs in the XML or in the Java config? And the answer is, it's your choice. It's a little bit harder if you're using Spring Boot to use XML. It's possible. So if you're using Spring Boot, you probably want to stick with the Java config. But if you're already using XML, like you can do anything in XML that you can do in Java config. And honestly, there's pluses and minuses to either side. So just to give you one example, a Java config, you get more likely to have circular dependency problems because it doesn't totally build bean definitions entirely at the beginning. It can only build the skeleton of it. So there's limitations to Java config. Whereas the XML, you can have an XML namespace that creates 10 beans with a single declaration. So an XML people hate, and Java config people generally like. So I mean, there's tons of pros and cons. If you want to discuss more of them, I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. Yes, sir. Yes, there is a repo. The easiest way to find it at this point is if you go to github.com/rwinch. It'll be the most active repo. I can put it up here for anyone viewing this video later on. But I think there's also going to be a repository for all the code for the conference, but I'm not sure where that is, but I'm sure they'll send an email to you with that. So let's do TextMate. So there's that URL. Do we have any other questions? Looks like the red card is saying 0. So I think we're out of, I apologize, we're out of time. But if you guys have any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them after we get down from the stage and kind of let the camera to wrap up. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the talk.